with Steve Maximay. Steve is an EU-recognized expert on climate change and was a member of the team that wrote the first risk management manual for climate change in the Caribbean. He is science advisor to ACM and by extension now to MIC, and he has worked in every CARICOM country. He is an advocate for just transitions. So it is only fitting that he is going to present right now on just transitions and how we examine the 4 interpretations of climate justice. Steve?
Thank you very much, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to be presenting at this time. I have to do some conscience clearing. Full disclosure, this is not going to be a presentation from an uninterested bystander. I am extremely biased. My focus is going to be on SIDS, on the Global South. I am going to be presenting perspectives that have been honed, not from some article that I may have read or someone that I may have spoken to, but because I'm part of the front line. I am a combatant in this fight. I am not approaching it with this balanced perspective that you hear so much about. I recognize that being on the front line means that your perspective is a lot different. So with that proviso, I shall proceed to share my screen. I'm going to attempt to run through my slides fairly quickly so that we have some time for the discussion subsequently. So, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are, Steve.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So I've been asked to speak about just transition and the 4 interpretations of climate justice. And I heard Oro remarking about his willingness to wait to see what I'm going to concoct in terms of 4 interpretations of climate justice. But this term just transition was originally associated with the US labor movement in the 1970s. And it broadened as labor forged alliances with environmental justice groups in the 1990s. And it emerged in response to increased regulation of industries that were deemed to be heavy polluters. But before we get into this, I think it's only fair that we have some definitions. So a transition is a process or period of changing from one state or condition to another. And that is fairly straightforward. Where the fun begins is when we start talking about just. When you hear people talk about a just transition, we are normally assuming that they're using just as an adjective, and it is based on or behaving according to what is morally right and fair, in other words, righteous. It is being what is merited, in other words, you're getting what you just deserve, what you deserve, and it's legally correct or lawful. But there's also another interpretation of just. Just can also be an adverb. There's only and simply. And there are times when we are being told in this part of the world to just transition. I mean, just transition, why all this fuss? It's not such a big thing. Just transition, stop being a crybaby. And you heard Jimmy, expound on all the different ways in which the global north has been telling us that. But CARICOM is no stranger to transitions, especially some of these decidedly unjust ones. We have had to do political transitions from colonialism to independence. We have had to do economic transitions from plantations to private farms to industrialization by invitation. We have had to do some industrial transitions as well, from goods to services. There was a time when this region was manufacturing or assembling goods. Now we're more or less consigned to doing services, especially those connected with tourism. There was also a failure to make intellectual property, and this is an area that I'm particularly passionate about, transition from seeing intellectual property as a legal imposition as opposed to an economic imperative. And if we have time, I'd like to spend some time on that later on in terms of what do I mean by that and how our lack of appreciation for intellectual property has stymied us in our efforts to just transition. Well, when it comes to climate change occasioned transitions, then this just transition is with respect to climate change implies that all those citizens disadvantaged by adaptation and mitigation action will be buffered through socioeconomic programs that protect livelihoods. I mean, it's really a task to come after Jimmy, but I think you all got a good explanation of what is involved. So this just transition is supposed to be fostering healthy, renewable economies, and in which we are going to be moving away from fossil fuel dependence and extractive industries. And there was this idea that the just aspect of transition is steeped in moral underpinnings of self-determination with respect to communities or countries. In other words, if it's going to be just, it has to be lawful, of course, and it should be self-imposed. We should be deciding on how we are going to transition. And this is going to be very, 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 very important when we start getting into some of the nitty-gritty of these climate justice issues. So I just want to repeat that this just aspect of the transition is steeped in moral underpinnings of self-determination with respect to the communities or countries involved. When we say just transition, it has none of the compulsory overtones associated with just do it, the Nike type response. Just do it. I mean, why are you all in the Caribbean always complaining? So what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 anyway? The idea is not to compel anyone to just transition and quit complaining. So that if we are to conceptualize, live, and breathe this idea of a just, where just is an adjective, transition, then we really have to approach it differently. There's an appreciation of the fact that the changes advocated in the quest for less carbon emissions are for the benefit of humankind. So this is where all the things that Jimmy mentioned and Orum hinted at, where we are now at the intersect of law, governance, civil society, advocacy, and the science. This is what is going to help us negotiate whatever this just transition is going to turn out to be. When you think about a tourism-dependent region like the Caribbean, an industry whose carbon footprint includes airline and maritime travel, ground transportation, food miles, just something we spend a little bit of time on, I hope. When you talk about air conditioning needs, and you saw what the projections are from Professor Taylor and the Climate Studies Group, Mona. Potable water use, and here again, I don't think anybody should mention water at this time without, at least making some sort of reference to the contribution of Dr. Seeley. Golf course irrigation, all the powered equipment that you need for the appliances and lighting and so that are associated with this tourism product, which the region has, has literally had its fill. So how do you just transition in an area that is dominated by a service industry and one in which you are on the front line as well? So what are some of the transitions that have been implied or implicated or tried to activate within the region? So we have had an amalgam of these planned mitigation as in the NDC, the nationally determined contributions. And we have had, and I'm not speaking out of school in this sense, we have had some forced adaptation-driven, very reactive policies and practices, which I am open to challenge on that, from anybody in the audience. Since agricultural production will continue to be negatively impacted by climate change, and it's going to lead to these forced adaptation-driven transitions. These transitions need to be just, adjective now, because the nutrition security of these nations will be significantly compromised. And again, no apologies for those statements. What have been the types and approaches to climate justice? And as I said, I'm running through this so that we have more time for us to have a conversation, because I am one of the believers in the DECOW continuum, where you go from data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and just throwing information at you by way of, several, however well-appointed slides is not enough. For us to make that transition to knowledge, we must interrogate the information. So that's why I'm throwing it at you this quickly so that we have more time to actually interrogate it. So when you talk about climate justice, and we've had definitions of climate justice before, so I won't go into that. But in terms of the interpretations, there's a distributive interpretation in terms of determining who gets what. And I'm going to be talking about something called CSAC when we get to that. Then there's a procedural type of climate justice. We are determining how fairly people are treated, and we're going to talk about a little more about just transitions when we get there. And then there's a retributive, which is based on punishment for wrongdoing, carbon taxation, we caught you, we know you're responsible, and this is how we're going to punish you. And there's the restorative, which is the one that I find most interesting, which tries to restore relationships to rightness. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the GCF funding and so for adaptation. And I think Jimmy did a really good job of hinting at what I'm going to be stressing, that this adaptation talk is in and of itself not enough. So let's get to distributive climate justice. Now, how are these alleged adaptive and mitigative resources being allocated? How do you limit greenwashing? And as I said, without getting into a separate conversation about greenwashing, I think most of you will know that there are some activities, projects, processes that appear green, but it's really greenwashing, and that, people are operating, it's business as usual, but, just with a green cover. And to show that I'm not just a bystander in this fight, I actually have a horse in the race. I have a commitment to addressing some of these things that I see as ills. So that one of the areas that I'm particularly strong on, and that is what Jimmy referenced when he said, I'm sure Steve will want to say something about this, is that we have been asked to develop climate smart agriculture. And over the years, unfortunately, we have had a series of these unidimensional projects claiming to be climate smart agriculture that have been cumulative at best, that have not been transformational. And I am now in a position to say publicly that one of the leading international organizations dealing with agriculture have commissioned UE, and me by extension, to look at some of these projects over the years that were really not transformative, and to come up with projects that are truly transformative. And it is in this sense that I am, again, saying that CSAC, which is a smart agriculture compliant prioritizing mechanism, is one of the ways in which you limit greenwashing. So without delving too much into that at this stage, I will go on to talk about some of the procedural climate justice type of issues. And this is determining how fairly people are treated. And I think Jimmy was there, but in Poland and Katowice with COP24, the whole idea of just transition, how do you, granted that I'm biased and that I have a SIDS and global South focus, but how do you tell people in the global North that you're to just transition from coal? What do you do in winter? As the popular maxim goes, while the grass is growing and the horse is going to be starving, what do people do in the interim? How do you tell people to just shut down all of their coal operations? And how do you then deal with the COLD operations in winter? And one of the most startling things surrounding procedural climate justice type discussions is this business about net zero and not zero. Let's remember that net zero is not about getting to a state where there are no more emissions from fossil fuels. What they have agreed, what the IPCC has agreed to, and what the UNFCCC has agreed to, is that there will be a point where there will be net zero, in the sense that the emissions emitted are going to be balanced, counterbalanced by the absorptive capacity of your sequestration methods or whatever mechanisms are in place. So that there have been suggestions that this net zero in 2050 is going to be probably comprised of 80% renewable energy use and 20% fossil fuels. The real fun starts, and this is a question that, that the Guyanas and Trinidad and Suriname and SIDS have to play with, is that who is going to be allowed to produce that 20% come 2050, 2051, 2052? How just is that transition going to be? How can you deny a starving horse by telling them to, continue starving, because we have grass coming? So that is going to be a really, really interesting conversation as we proceed for the next 4 days, but I thought I'd want to just flag it. Then there's retributive climate justice. I know this is the one that I suppose most of us are most familiar with. It's based on punishment for wrongdoing, the polluter pays principle. A lot of local legislation is based on that. These carbon taxes, because there's this concept of atmospheric commons. In other words, if I pollute here in Grenada, where I happen to be now, where we're living, I'm really polluting atmospheric commons. I mean, that pollution is not going to just hover over Montgelou or St. George's or wherever I happen to be today. It is going to be common. So there's such a concept as atmospheric commons, so that if I pollute here, people are going to feel the impact in the Pacific, right? Where people living on atolls are going to see their entire life and island disappear. So then that is where carbon taxes come in. But as with all justice type systems, in the same vein that you have carbon taxes, there are also carbon credits that have been developed so that polluters, and we have to be blunt, polluters in the north can offset their pollution by utilizing carbon credits from this part of the world. And don't get me wrong, and I'm not totally averse to the system, and I'm just saying that it is a stopgap. It's not a solution. And then there's restorative climate justice. Again, as I said, it's really difficult to follow Jimmy. Jimmy hinted at this. And this is where you're looking to restore relationships to rightness. In other words, some GCF, this is a Green Climate Fund, by the way. Some GCF grant funding is focused on this aspect. So narrowly define resilience, into something that is primarily adaptive. And I am on record, and I'm very, very pleased to announce this, and to show off literally about this, is that I, in public, had Professor Michael Taylor, who is a regional guru, and a member of, a number of IPCC editorial committees, agree with me that this IPCC definition of resilience is not applicable for us here in the region. And it has to do with, and this is the official IPCC definition of resilience. I mean, we all can read, of course. I'm not going to be reading it out to you. But what we agreed on in principle was that here, this talk about resilience had better have some mitigative components to it. Here's why. If we fail to involve mitigation, and if, as again, following on from what Jimmy said, if you are going to restore me to some position that I was in before, I'm not too sure how just that is. Because if you're just going to restore me to what the business as usual scenario was before, then if, as was mentioned earlier, if I just lost, 8 or 10% of my landmass, my limited landmass, why would you want to restore me to that level? And we're talking about a different level of compensation now. So that would be my take on why this narrow definition of resilience is not applicable to us in the region. As I said, I hope I did a good job of rushing through some of those, fairly headline topics so that we have more time to interrogate whatever information I was able to share with you. And you get to look me in the face and see my response to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Steve. Steve, I just want to jump into it because I saw Sayuni had a question. So let me just pull that up. She says, if possible, it would be interesting to hear you censor the IP issue in hampering Caribbean's just transitions. Is it a discussion that is ongoing that you're aware of?
Well, the idea is that, as I said, being a combatant in this intersect, I was lucky enough to be on the cabinet appointed committee that wrote the intellectual property policy for Trinidad and Tobago. And I completed their first intellectual property strategy, national strategy. So I'm coming from this from the perspective of somebody who knows a little bit about intellectual property. We have been subject, and this is all part of the whole justice and restoration bit, to a lot of, let's take a simple case, bioprospecting. We have had people come to this part of the world, take our germplasm or plant material, let's say, head up north, go into a laboratory, and then produce something that they now own, that they have trademark, licensed, gotten geographical indications for, what have you. Let me just give you a quick analogy. It is similar to someone coming to the region with a handheld tape recorder. Tape something from Beckett, my age is going to show now in terms of the examples I'm using, but tape something from Beckett, tape something from Calypsonian Beckett for the people outside the region, tape something from Sparrow, tape something from Aleutian Calypsonian, like Haggai, let's say. Take those compilations, go up to the US, and now print a record and say that they own the copyright for it. It's a similar type analogy, because we have always seen intellectual property here as a legal imposition. When you talk intellectual property, when I was doing the research for the strategy, every organization I went to, they said, oh, we need to talk to our lawyers. With all due respect to lawyers, lawyers have nothing to do with intellectual property. They have to do with the protection of the rights, right? Intellectual property rights. But the actual intellectual property is about creators. It's about creators, people who are creating the works of art or whatever it is that is the outcome of human processes. So I'm saying that because we have not licensed, copyrighted, trademarked, listed as trade secrets, our transitional methods, we have now found ourselves at a loss that we're actually buying some of our own stuff back. I mean, to put it bluntly. And because I'm not just talking about this, that is why that CSAC thing that they developed is a trademark, SIDS-based approach. That is how I'm putting my money where my mouth is, literally. So sorry for the extended answer, but
No, thanks for that, Steve.